Well, we're really fortunate to have Jim today, particularly as we're looking at flooding being our focus for Summer Institute's within this for the next 2 years. Jim's a real expert. He's been working with the Center for Emergency Informatics on these big engineering research grants for 2 years, for 5 years on the last 2. And part of the team from civil engineering that's been trying to, quote, civilize the rest of us. And so I've learned a great deal, particularly the difference between deep water and some of the shallow littoral and the things there. Your expertise is just awesome. And your practical work with going with for Army Corps of Engineers,
Yeah.
which I now see as a case. Whenever I see a case, I'm thinking of cards, I wonder about that. And so practical expertise and theoretical expertise. And we're glad to have you today to talk with us
Thanks.
on modeling surge and waves.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks. Well, I think my sort of expertise in terms of my published work has been primarily on the wave side of things, but we have been making some inroads into surge modeling as well. So essentially the way I've kind of constructed this talk is essentially to talk about sort of the general problem, some of the physics, and then kind of go a little bit into the work that I've been doing that is a little bit kind of step back away from the practical side, but can be applied to more practical applications of surge and wave prediction. So these are some of the people who have funded me, and I thank them as always. Okay, so this is a picture of me of back when I was cooler. And so this is some of my background here, but the thing I kind of want to note here is that prior to coming to A&M, I was an oceanographer for the Naval Research Lab at the Stennis Space Center for 11 years, and there the focus was primarily on developing things that the Navy could use, and there is sort of a very short turnaround type things like for instance, we want to go upriver to take out this bad guy and come out. When's a good time to go? And we would, not that that actually happened, mind you. This is, just I don't want to have to take the whole room out. But primarily just to provide them these quick prediction tools that they can use to on scene to kind of get an idea of when it would be a good time to actually do whatever enterprise they were they were tasked to do. So. Okay, so it seems to be running over a little bit, I guess. This is what you were warning me about, I think. Okay. Okay, well, anyway. So this slide just kind of encapsulates some of the stuff that I've been interested in over the past few years, both in some of the Navy work that I've been doing and since I've been here at A&M. A lot of my work has gone into taking a look at dissipation effects by mud and by vegetation of the ocean waves. And the reason for that is because, in particular vegetation, there's been a push in this sort of the coastal engineering community to use wetlands and planted vegetation as a means, as a sort of a storm buffer. And sometimes it has unintended effects, as I'll talk about. And also near shore nonlinear waves, which is basically what I've been spending a lot of time doing. Wave breaking effects, data assimilation and optimal sampling, which is kind of where I see sort of a nice general, a natural coupling of my work with people who are doing, developing platforms for instrumentation and doing real-time sampling as a way of actually using their data to kind of improve the prediction that we're making. Wind wave modeling, the various hurricanes and stuff, they're very, sort of a very large database of things to test out. And we're also getting into the laboratory and field experimentation, particularly with respect to tsunamis, and I'll talk a little bit about that. Okay, so this is our current list of generous donors to the cause, and some funding from NSF. I've been fortunate enough to get some significant amount of my research funding profiles that come from the Office of Naval Research. We've also gotten some funding from the Qatar National Research Fund to do some field experimentation and also to do some modeling in the Gulf in the Gulf area. And one that I'll be talking about is probably of particular interest here is a project from NOAA Sea Grant, where we're looking at parameterizing waves and surge for efficient prediction in the near shore. So,
Like Cutter?
pardon me?
Mike's Cutter interested?
Well, they have their QNRF is sort of they're interested in getting an idea of what their coastlines are doing, because everybody wants to live in Doha now. I think they're building all these causeways, and there's the beaches there are interesting because it's not really silica based like if you go to like the East Coast, that sort of sand. It's mostly calcium carbonate, so it dissolves as well as actually erodes. So, and a lot of times, from what I've seen, the way they build the causeways is they actually go into the middle of the country, mine these big blocks of limestone and grind them up, and they build these causeways for, I guess, these high-priced real estate. And so there was some interest in trying to figure out what their the sediment is doing, what the erosion patterns are, as well as with the wind. They have the shamal, so they're very quick, bursty type winds, and everything's calm, and all of a sudden it gets really rocky, and then it gets calm again. And so there's been some interest in trying to figure out how to predict that better. So.
And which division of NSF do you go to?
This one is a CMMI. It's a civil mechanical. And this is actually through the NICE program for engineering research.
Ah.
Yeah, the one that's actually going away.
Is that right?
Yeah. It's it's becoming less. From what I understand, it's becoming less earthquake oriented and more general hazards oriented. I think they're kind of opening it up.
And is there any relationship to the geo director?
Not. I think some of the work that's being proposed now that might be tsunami related will be picked up. Some of it will be picked up by the geotechnical directorate and CMMI, from what I understand. But we can't submit to NICE anymore because it's not going to exist. So, okay. So, and then the next slide talks. Oops. Okay. Page down. Top, down. Windows. Okay, it's confusing. We're confused. There. Okay. All right. Okay. So just a few. We have some doctoral students who have worked with me. Most of them are still working, and the one graduated is presently a postdoc at Stanford and is now actively looking on the market as his postdoc's about to expire. And then some Master of Science students working with me as well, and they've generally gone on. One has stayed for his PhD, and the rest have gone on to careers in Houston and elsewhere doing coastal engineering type work. Okay, so a little bit about just a brief overview of some of the physics relevant to hurricanes and tsunamis. So we know in the northern hemisphere that the tropical cyclone will generally have a counterclockwise rotation. So there's going to be a side of the hurricane that's going to be what we'll call, quote unquote, the bad side, which is generally the eastern side of the hurricane. And then the western side is generally considered the better side. If you have to experience the winds of a hurricane, that's probably where you would rather be. Because they're the winds, when they make landfall on the Gulf Coast, the winds are coming off of land and they're weaker, and the surge isn't nearly as high. But there is surge nonetheless. On the eastern side, the winds are blowing from the ocean on toward land, and the surge is much higher. So the thing that's important is that there's the way we typically do modeling for hurricanes is and the surges is that we model the surges and the waves separately, kind of separately. The surges actually are wind driven. There might be an additional tide level on there based on the phase of the tide, but the waves are modeled by a different model, and that information fed to the surge model. And the reason for that is that as waves break, they actually increase the mean sea level, but they actually add on to the surge. if you ignore the effect of the wave dissipation and the setup, which is what we call it, you can underpredict the overall surge by as much as 15%. So
that racing is because of braking?
yeah, braking happens, and so there's basically a change in what's known as the radiation stress gradient. So that ends up adding more energy to the amount of energy being dissipated is essentially reflected in a mean sea level increase. So. And so what happens, though, is that depending on where you are in the Gulf, the surge can actually have different effects. Unfortunately, this is a single frame from a really cool shockwave flash movie that it's on the web. But essentially, the idea is that, and the way this thing, what this represents is that if you have a relatively, for most of the Gulf, the continental shelf is relatively flat. You can Louisiana, Texas, Mississippi in particular, you can go a long way out and the water depth would not be very deep. And so what that tends to do is that allows the wind to carry more of the water depth along with it and increase the size of the surge. So the surge is much higher, generally, for the size, for a given wind speed. On the other hand, if you're in Miami, the shelf there is actually fairly steep. And so you go that same amount of distance out and the water is a lot deeper, and thus the surge isn't nearly as high for the same same wind speed. So, and this is just a shot of Crystal Beach, both before and after Hurricane Ike. Obviously, Bolivar Peninsula is very flat, and the continental shelf out there is very flat as well, so the surge is much more devastating. Okay. So I do have a little bit of my own personal experience with a hurricane. This is Hurricane Katrina. This is my house.
Bay St. Louis.
Yeah, Bay St. Louis, yeah.
That never I grew up in that area, so it
yeah.
never really hit.
Right, yeah.
That was such a surprise.
It was a surprise, and I think the problem, in terms of the local philosophy, the problem was that everyone used Camille as a benchmark, and Camille was a much smaller storm. So, yeah, Katrina did a lot of damage here. But so I lived where the pad elevation of my house is 21 feet, which is a veritable mountain. You can walk up from the beach and hear your ears pop. But then on top of that, I also had 2 feet of space under the house. So the floor elevation is 23 feet, and we had 3 feet of surge inside. So that's 26 feet of surge inside this house. And anyway, so we had to sort of rebuild all this, and then at some point my wife said, "Look, put on your good suit and get us out of here." So so that's kind of what happened, and we figured we'd make ourselves vulnerable to a different type of natural disaster for a while. So anyway, so it was interesting too is that I was I think one day I was carting stuff out from my house to the street where they were going to pick it up, like ruined refrigerators and stuff. And a friend of mine at University of South Alabama calls me up and says, "Hey, what was the surge level in your house?" And I told him, and he goes, "Oh, what's your address?" And I told him, and he looked at his model result and he goes, "Oh, that's too high," and he hung up. And I goes, so that was this data point. You know? I need more friction. Okay, let me know. So anyway, so at that point we decided to go do something else. Now, one of the things about hurricanes is that even though you might be on the good side of the hurricane, you can still get a lot of damage. And the damage that we saw, I was on a team that looked at the damage after Hurricane Ike. It was funded by ASCE. Even though you're on what we might consider the good side of the hurricane, there's actually still a lot of damage and a lot of different type of damage. Say at a place like Freeport, than say at a place like Crystal Beach. So Crystal Beach, this is supposedly this is sort of representing the track of Ike. And so Crystal Beach is over here, bad side, Freeport's over there. And so one of the things that we noticed in Crystal Beach is that even though the houses were gone and all you essentially saw were these the piles or maybe the so just the root, sort of smashed in front face of the houses, the road was fine. For the most part. It was covered with mud, but it was essentially in good shape. Now in Freeport, the surge was lower, which means that the orbital motion of the waves was actually a lot lower to the roadbed than it was over in Bolivar Peninsula. So it actually chewed up the road pretty well in this area because it was basically doing the sort of scour underneath the roadbed and causing all this damage. And then the other thing too is that the damage mode, if you will, of the houses were a little bit different. You actually got essentially cases where it's because of the low surge and the waves chewing up the support underneath the foundations. The foundation pilings lost a lot of their skin friction, and so they just kind of collapsed rather than were carried away by the high surge. So, we saw both ends of this.
What is piling losing its skin friction?
Oh, okay.
A piling that's just a...
Yeah, you have a big foundation pile, right? And there should be like a concrete footing underneath. But there are two modes that the pile is using from the earth to keep it up. And one of it is just the bearing pressure on the footing, and the other is just the friction of the pile and the earth, so like the sand, essentially, is helping to keep it together, right? Yeah, and so what's happening then is that because of the orbital motion of the waves, it's actually liquefying, so that support is going away. And so if the house really doesn't have that concrete cap or that concrete footing, then basically it's losing all its support, all its lateral support, and it's just going to collapse. That's kind of what's happening.
Essentially, it's no longer buried.
Yeah, right.
It doesn't act like it's buried.
Exactly. Yeah, it's just like in water rather. So. Okay, so tsunamis is another coastal hazard that is of interest, and even though we haven't really been hit with a tsunami in the U.S. Lately, there have been some instances in Hawaii, and Crescent City, California always gets hit with whatever is happening on the other side of the Pacific Ocean. Generally what happens here is that you've got basically two plates sticking as they move. There's as one of the plate moves under the other plate, there's actually a sort of a distortion of the upper plate, so it's actually dragging it, and at some point it's going to spring loose. And at that point, that's when you generate a tsunami. Now, the interesting thing about the tsunami is that oftentimes the leading wave that you see hitting the coast is a depression wave, so it's not a crest, it's actually a trough. And so that's when, if you're sitting on the beach, the water all of a sudden pulls out a long distance, and you go out there and try to get all the fish, and then the crest happens, and then that's the problem there. So, in sort of difference to, in contrast to what's happening with the surge, where you have a high water level and big waves on top of it breaking, and that could last as long as the hurricane lasts. Tsunami is relatively short, but it's sort of an inexorable piling up of water. So this waterfront just keeps pushing and pushing and pushing. And then after a short amount of time, it goes away, and leaving the damage in its wake. So a lot of the same damage occurs between what happens in a hurricane and what happens in the tsunami. It's just that when it happens in tsunami, it happens much faster. Just do two beeps. Okay, did I
click on the middle part of it?
Middle part of the...
Like on the image and stuff. And then try to click.
Oh, okay. All right, okay. So what's being done now in terms of a predictive capability for hurricanes? The NOAA model is that's being used now is called SLOSH. It's an acronym for something, I forget. But anyway, so the idea here is that you have relatively fast operational predictions for surge. You lose a lot of the fidelity of the physics, but it's actually able to provide relatively fast predictions and give you an idea, because it's also doing things like ensemble, so it's accounting for uncertainties in the input. You actually also do get some uncertainties in your sort of error estimates of your prediction. So it could be the waves are the surge could be this high plus or minus X amount, which is useful. It doesn't include the effects of waves, so the setup that's caused by waves isn't included. There's limited accuracy in its inundation algorithm, so even though it's technically able to move water onto land, that the ability for it to do that accurately is still a little bit in question.
And what is fast?
Fast is a good question. And basically, if in terms of predictive capability, if you do predictions, say once every 3 hours, and you put it up on or once every 6 hours, typically for NOAA, they'll put well, for the weather models and for other models, they'll put up predictions that go out to 48 hours, and they'll update that every 6 hours. So every 6 hours you have to be able to turn around a forecast. And so the slosh model is capable of doing that. In fact, I think the slosh model is actually can be run on a PC, so it's relatively quick in that aspect.
Right. So one of my misgivings about that word is that
Sure.
the word suggests to me, well, every few years, the computational capabilities of a small cluster
Yeah.
go up tremendously.
Right.
And so a decision about fast versus accuracy trade-off
Yeah.
might make sense in 2005 and make no sense in 2015.
That's true. I think the other thing about this particular model is that it can be run locally as well. So you might be someone who's a civil defense manager in, say, Galveston, and have to get an idea of what's going to happen and be able to run that on the PC right there, as opposed to waiting for NOAA to update their forecasts.
Which leads to another issue, which is the data inputs required to run it. So one is computational power,
Right.
and one is the labor
Yeah.
and sophistication of assembling the input data.
Right.
Both the fixed data, like the terrain of the
Yeah.
seafloor, and the other one is the real-time data.
Right. The winds
Right.
and stuff like that.
And a local person might not have as much access to the real-time data.
Right, but the way these forecast systems generally work is that they would do things like automatically look for data sources. And so the way the NOAA models tend to work is that you would have a sort of a desktop installation, and you'd activate it and would go on the web and do SFTP to grab all the available wind fields
Right.
and be able to run it locally. So yeah, there is a trade-off in the sense of, okay, what do we need to do right now versus, is NOAA gonna give us a better answer? But at its base, there's still going to be some loss of fidelity of the physics with this particular model.
So fidelity to you, so what is that? So I'm thinking, having
Yeah.
just sat through a workshop with a bunch of social scientists,
Yeah.
and I'm thinking about evacuation. Are
Right.
we talking like meters,
Yeah,
mile,
it could be, well, let's see.
3 centimeters?
No. It would be on the order of maybe half a meter, something like that. So essentially, if you're in an area where it's very
do this part of your house.
Yeah.
So they could take.
Yeah.
So low fidelity for you guys could be really great fidelity for the rest of your decision makers.
Right, but I think the issue though with this particular model in particular is the inundation aspect. So if you underpredict your inundation, all of a sudden you have an area that the terrain's relatively flat, like it is in most coastal areas. All of a sudden you are forgetting to tell people maybe within a mile, maybe a mile inland further, that they should be evacuating as opposed to just the local area right around the beach. So there are some consequences to that. Okay, and for tsunamis, it's actually a little bit more complicated, simply because the models that they use for doing tsunami predictions are actually pretty computationally intensive relative to being able to do this on a desktop. They actually have some pre-calculated databases for tsunamis that they generate by probable seismic activity, and then they query that database based on where the actual fault might have happened, and then generate a sort of a prediction for tsunami inundation. So they pre-calculate with pretty sophisticated models that do the inundation well, but then the issue there is that the database may not be comprehensive. There's always going to be a factor of whether or not the fault is actually where you thought the fault was going to be in your database. Okay, so what's being done now in terms of a more, I guess, increased fidelity, if you will, in terms of predictions, is a couple of these models. One is AdCirc, and this is the one that folks at North Carolina are running, and this is generated by, I guess the originator is Johannes Westerink over in Notre Dame. And so it's a finite element model, so you actually, in an area like this where you really need a lot of resolution inside that inlet, it can do that. It's unstructured, so you can basically just tell it to zoom in and put lots of points inside that and basically reduce the resolution where it isn't that important. And on top of that, so this is for the hydrodynamic stuff, so this will handle tides and the surge. And then they've also developed, the folks at Delft Hydraulics, not Delft Hydraulics, Technical University of Delft, have also developed a SWAN model, which is a phase average wave model, about which I'll talk a little bit more about later. And that's also been adapted to a finite element scheme. So these two models talk to each other pretty seamlessly now. And then there's also Delft 3D, which is what I've had a lot of experience with. It's a hydrodynamic model. It also uses SWAN to drive the waves, and so we can do things. This is some not fallout, but some remainders of my Navy work where we have this large area, which is the Southern California Bight. We're able to zoom in on this area. Well, I guess that little figure didn't show up. Black's Beach and near La Jolla and Scripps Institution of Oceanography, and we can do things like predict rip currents and rip current effects in a relatively confined area, which is what they were concerned about for their exercises and so on. So these models are good. They don't generally hew toward the sort of relatively rapid turnaround time of, say, a model like Slosh in particular. So there's still sort of a gap, despite the fact that computational speeds, and there's all sorts of parallelization going on, there's still a large gap between getting a model like this to provide you real-time forecasts versus using something like Slosh.
Right. Was Delft 3D designed, I mean, it was from the Netherlands. Yeah. One can imagine it was designed with local interests in mind, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
How does that different geographical context?
Oh, you mean whether or not the
they're dealing with North Sea storms,
right? Well, I think it still is general. It's still applicable. I mean, the folks at Deltaris, who Delft Hydraulics is morphed into, anytime there's a major tropical cyclone, they've got, within hours, they have a simulation using Delft 3D on YouTube. Mm-hmm. So they're relatively quick on this, and so it's there's really not a problem doing things like hurricane surge. You actually use it for tsunamis, which worries me a little bit for various reasons, but it's in terms of the what sort of its physics might be tied into their local phenomena. I don't think that's an issue per se. Okay, so there's still a gap in terms of being able to predict and do lots of simulations. The other thing too is that if you want to do things like develop maps of hurricane damage risk, you need to do a lot of simulations, and it's not clear that you can simply do that just using the model, using any of those two models just running well, there's going to be some lag. So one of the things that we've done for our Sea Grant project is look at the parameterization of hurricane, both surge and waves. This is work I've been doing with Dr. Jen Irish, who used to be here. She's over in Virginia Tech now.
Oh, really?
Yeah, yeah. So pretty far away from the coast.
She learned some things in her work that made her want to move.
Maybe. That's right, probably. Well, it's interesting because for this project, we also had some folks on the social science side, and one person was at Florida, and she started working on this project, and now she's at the University of Oklahoma. So I'm just wondering if there isn't a pattern here. They should let us know. Anyway, so what we did was we got some pre-calculated both wave and hurricane wave and hurricane surge fields. Some we ran ourselves, some were run by the Corps of Engineers, and also Scott Hagen's group at the University of Central Florida. And what we did is we chose 3 locations in the Gulf, each of which had different sort of different demographics. So Corpus Christi, Gulfport, Gulfport, Mississippi, which is a big port, and Panama City, which has got a lot of military installations. And we chose that primarily for the folks doing sort of the social science demographic aspect of the work. And then what we did is we took the fields that were calculated and tried to parameterize them with respect to hurricane parameters. Now, the hurricanes themselves, even though there's a lot going on, a lot of their bulk characteristics like the maximum winds and so on can be described in a handful of parameters. And so the idea is that if you might know what the probability of those parameters occurring are, and you're able to take a set of parameters and calculate waves and surge, then now all of a sudden you got the probability of that particular surge related to those hurricane parameters. And so what we then do is we develop these parameterizations so we don't have to keep running the model to come up with estimates of the surge and the waves, and then couple the parameterizations to these the extreme value statistics of these hurricane parameters like pressure and radius to maximum winds and so on. And so what we then do is we're able to develop a return period curve for both waves and surge. So we're able to say, okay, this is going to be the 100-year wave, this is going to be the 100-year surge. You can expect one of these on average once every 100 years. And that is basically what FEMA and other organizations use to develop their flooding maps. So we're actually coming up with ways of predicting these risks, areas of high risk of flooding that that are a little bit different from what you see in some of the FEMA maps. So, which is always kind of a concern when you say, oh yeah, our maps tend to be a little bit low resolve. We don't actually show the streets, corners, and stuff like that, so people don't get too nervous. So we have, yeah, we have area. I just bought that house. Yeah, we have. So basically, what we do is we have stations that we establish. This is the Bay of St. Louis, and my house is right about here. The Bay of St. Louis is Biloxi Bay, and we have areas that we've established as being stations. And what we do is we run various storms and take note of their landfall location and the other parameters, central pressure and radius to maximum winds, and mine the data set that we have for the wave heights and also the surge. And so with that, we're able to come up with just sort of a line that kind of predicts the size of the waves and the size of the surge as a function of these hurricane parameters, including the location relative to the point that we're interested in. And then we couple that with extreme value statistics to come up with these return period curves. It's kind of hard to see, but on the y-axis here is surge in this case, and on the x-axis is return period in years. So this is about the 100-year return period, and that is for this particular location, it turns out to be maybe a surge of about 4 meters for that area. So you can expect a 4-meter surge on average once every 100 years. Okay, and then one of the things that, in terms of the interesting science aspects that we figured out, is that one thing that happens with waves in particular that doesn't necessarily happen with surge is that as the winds increase, the waves stop growing, and so there's only a maximum wave height that they grow to. And a lot of times for the open coastal area, all we have to do is determine what that maximum wave height is, and we actually do a pretty good job of doing performing the parameterization for those areas. Inside these embayments, where the area of the open water is a lot smaller, is not able to blow, the wind isn't able to blow the waves to the maximum height. We have to be a little bit more crafty and use something that's more along the growing part of the growth curves rather than the already grown part of the growth curves. And so we have a couple of strategies for handling those. And as I mentioned before, another thing we do is we take the return period flooding and waves that we've developed, and then kind of project them onto a map of like an elevation map of an area of interest. This is Panama City, And these different colors denote sort of the, the different levels of combined waves and surge for at the 100-year level for various areas. So some areas, I think green is okay, and red, when you get redder, it gets to be a little bit more more worrisome in terms of the 100-year surge. So here, the 100-year surge is relatively high. Here, the 100-year surge is relatively low. And for some reason, the color map and the color bar didn't make it onto this plot, probably by design, I guess. But anyway, so we're able to do this sort of thing now as well. And at some point, we can compare them to what FEMA has predicted, but we'll see.
Jim, I noticed the vocabulary of once every 100 years, of course, suggests a staticness.
Yeah, which is not at all.
Which is untrue for at least two different reasons, right? I'm interested in your thoughts on this. One of them is generalized climate change, which we can talk about. The other one is a more localized thing, which is each one of these storms, particularly I was the first time I ever really remember in Texas people talking about semi-permanent change to the three-dimensional shape of the barrier island.
Yeah. Yeah, right. And one thing that we don't include in any of these models is the effect of morphology. So what happens if you have a surge and all of a sudden you've shaved off the top, half meter of your barrier island, or like in Katrina when you basically cut, or in Camille, like you basically cut through Ship Island, and now you've got East Ship Island and West Ship Island. So Ship Island, I think so. But anyway, yeah, we don't include any of that, and that would definitely have an effect on our predictive capability, or the fidelity, or the 100-year storms. So, but yeah, we're definitely missing that. In terms of the generalized climate change and maybe sea level rise, we are including that in our estimates as kind of an error, so basically an uncertainty that we then tack on to our estimates. If we say this is going to be the 100-year floodplain plus or minus, X, the effect of sea level rise goes into helping to evaluate that uncertainty. So it's in there, but it's not it isn't part of the major product, I guess. We'll give you the error, help define the error bounds.
So it doesn't go into your means, but into your standard deviation.
Yeah.
It's in the file.
Right.
That's it. Interesting. I mean, from a political point of view, I can imagine me talking to local politicians, and they don't believe any of this stuff, right?
Right.
But they might be snowed by your talk of standard deviations, not pushing it.
That's right.
Gives you a cover.
Yeah. Well, yeah. That's true. We haven't had to do that yet, but I'm sure the time will come. Okay, so some of the other work that I've been doing, and I'll kind of go, I know I'm running low on time, so I'll kind of go through this relatively quickly, is looking at improving wave modeling. And a lot of the stuff that we've been doing has been taking large-scale wave models, like this is one that NOAA runs called WaveWatch 3, which for some reason is always abbreviated WW3, which makes everybody nervous. Trying to improve this predictive capability in relatively shallow water. So let's say 20 meters of water depth and shallower. There's a relatively large team that was funded by ONR to help improve the predictive capability of this model in shallow water. And the part that I'm working on primarily has been in taking a look at wave dissipation in estuaries, mud, vegetation and breaking, also the effects of stratified flow. So this is just real briefly the way we typically predict or depict random waves is by a spectrum. So we have energy as a function of the frequency. So if you've got a wave field that has many different frequencies, you all have different amounts of energy. And the way we model them is in that form. So as the waves propagate, say over a flat bottom or over a sloping bottom, the shape of the spectrum, which is shown here, actually changes. So it goes from something that's very peaked at with a peak period, right, a peak frequency of at a given point, to something where there's a lot of amplification of low frequency energy and the amplification of high frequency energy. It's the amplification of low frequency energy that should worry people who are concerned about flooding, because these are very long waves. They might as well be surge. And in a few cases, as I'll talk about, even instances where you think, okay, if we just plant the big wetland over here, we'll be able to save ourselves from flooding, end up actually inadvertently amplifying this low frequency, and so you can actually exacerbate the flooding effects. So the models that we run, that I have run since time immemorial here, actually do give you this type of behavior. The models that are being run for predictive capability right now, WaveWatch 3 and WHAM and all these others that are run by operational centers, don't. And so our charge is basically to try to bridge the gap between what we're able to do with an unlimited amount of computational time to what they need to do with an unlimited amount of computational time. All right, so one of the things we've done is incorporate ways. Oops, what happened?
Trail tab.
Oh, which one?
Alt tab.
Alt. Oh, okay. Okay, yeah. Okay. One thing that we've done is incorporate mud into our models, made our models muddy, because in a lot of estuarine areas there's a great deal of mud, and we know relatively little about the processes due to mud. So this is just a nice pictorial here where you have waves propagating from left to right. The crest is shown in these white streaks here. They propagate over this box that's got nothing but mud in it, and it's basically dampening out the waves on the lee side of that mud box. And the other thing that's happening there is that the waves on either side of this are actually, propagating into this hole of energy, right? So it's basically a diffraction effect. And this is something that can be a pretty big factor in terms of wave setup as well, because now you've got an area where you have a lot of dissipation bordered by areas where you have very little dissipation. That tends to increase or change the mean water level, and you can actually get some minor surge effects that way as well. Okay. Windows. Oh, okay. I feel so old. All right. I probably won't go over this. I think I'm running out of time here. Okay, so this is some aspects I was talking about before, where we have large scale, where we have waves propagating over vegetation. We actually have a vegetation damping mechanism in our wave model, and we predict what's going on with in a wave experiment where they actually put in some wooden dowels that are representative of dissipation of vegetation, and take a look at the wave heights as they propagate through there. One other test just kind of show a general damping reduction of wave energy, just because of the drag of the wave, of the flow, of the fluid flow past these individual cylinders. But this one actually shows an increase in this low frequency energy. Even though there's a little bit of damping up over here, it's actually increasing the low frequency energy here, which is going to sort of counter the effect that you hope you would get if you wanted to plant these, not wooden dowels per se, but although that'd be funny, vegetation as a means of dampening out storm effects. So what you're actually doing this would not happen if you didn't have the wooden dowels and the vegetation in there. Now all of a sudden you got the vegetation, you're increasing the low frequency energy, and you might actually be increasing the flooding risk. So a little bit about optimizing models. I'm going to go through this relatively quickly. So this is kind of we were talking about Guy in terms of I have a model, I've got stuff I need to put in the model. The model, all that stuff is errors, and I've got predictions that I then need to put error bounds around, and then also what kind of decisions do I need to make. So one of the things that this is actually working the other way around, it might be also interesting to those who are doing instrumentation on movable platforms in the ocean, is one of the things we have to do for a model is we have to give it the underwater landscape, or the bathymetry. So this is a plot of just different bathymetric surveys that were done for La Jolla, California. So where you have these very strong submarine canyons, these two canyons right here. So the canyons are very evident. So there's a lot of effort required in actually measuring all the water depth everywhere in this area. That's probably about 6 kilometers on the side. And once you do that, you run a nice wave model like SWAN, and you get a prediction of the wave height. But the thing is, for a model like SWAN or other wave models, they may only respond to, they may not respond to every little nook and cranny of that canyon. They may respond to just, and you may be oversampling for the good that you're going to do for this model, right? So the idea here would be to, if you want this response, invert the question by saying, how much of this do you need to get that kind of response? So, how much, accurately, right. So if you take this as a standard by which you compare, can you then sort of decompose your sampling scheme so that you can still not do any harm to this prediction, right? And you save some time. So we actually use genetic algorithms to do that, and we are able, I'll go past this real quick. My student understood this better than me. And we were able to come up with a way of optimizing a survey path. So here we might have an unmanned underwater vehicle. We say, okay, it's really only good, it really can only go out there for a limited amount of time. What is the path that it has to take? And then we can then take the bathymetry and then extrapolate from it and then run the model. And so, I'm learning. So even though the bathymetry looks horrible, it doesn't look anything like what we would hope to get, the wave prediction actually looks pretty good compared to what you would have if you had all the bathymetry there. So this gives you an idea perhaps of if you're doing sampling to improve a model, can you actually optimize that process?
Well, it's kind of a cat and mouse thing too, isn't it?
Yeah.
You could say a given model can't make use of any more than a certain amount of bathymetry, but then you might invert that to say, for the bathymetry that is becoming available, what kind of improved models do you need? Yeah, exactly, and particularly since if you're using something like an AUV, you can actually improve these set databases for bathymetry and actually do a better job in the near shore where you might need it. Now again, this is also relatively deep water, right through this canyon, so if you're really interested in the shallow water, then maybe the optimization isn't going to save you much because you might really need to mow the lawn as fine as you had intended initially. I'm not going to go over this. I think this is I'm kind of losing time here. So we're doing some wind wave modeling for the Gulf, for the Persian Gulf, for the Arabian Gulf. Pretend, I'm not going to. I'll just call it the Gulf. And exactly, and they tend to call it the Gulf. So this is Qatar, this is Doha. Everybody wants to live in Doha. So they're building, as I mentioned, they're building these causeways out into the Gulf to build these very expensive homes. And they don't really have their oceanographic environment is generally pretty calm. The Gulf is a very large, shallow body of water. When you have these shamals that come over the winds from, come over the mountains of Iraq and come down the long axis of the Gulf, it tends to turn things up for a brief amount of time, then things die down again, and then you have another shamal. So during the summer and the summertime shamal, which I think is March through June, and then the winter time, which is September through February, October through February, they have these events, and the winter times are actually fairly energetic. And so, because for Qatar, all their energy resources are offshore, they have to do a lot of marine. There's a lot of marine traffic that takes material and support and resources out to these platforms, and then all of a sudden they might be out in the middle of the Gulf. They think everything's nice and cozy, and then all of a sudden they get hit by big waves that are generated by these sudden bursty winds. And so what we did is we actually convinced the airport authority to let us use their construction pier that they're using for their new airport to maintain some of the runway lights. And we put out a weather station, we put out a few other instruments to take a look at the video, to take a look at the waves.
and also some sonic anemometers to take a look at the wind patterns. This is very briefly here, but there really isn't a whole lot in terms of measurements in the Gulf. There aren't a lot, particularly around Qatar. Most of it is in Oman, by the Straits of Hormuz, or up in Kuwait. So right around Qatar, there really isn't a whole lot, and so it's been kind of tough to validate the models that we've been using. But we have developed sort of a modeling strategy where we have a very large-scale wave model that's relatively coarse, and we nest it down to an area where we're actually looking at waves right there in that dot. And we're using different wind sources. So the idea here, just for the bottom line, picture is that, depending on which wind source, what hindcast wind source you use, whether you use what the Navy gives you or whether you use what NOAA gives you, you can actually get a significant difference in your answers in terms of what the wave climate is going to be in the near shore. So that's this paper where, how there's always reviewer number 2. So we're doing battle with reviewer number 2, who, if they happen to be listening, and I mean, no harm, you're wonderful. But we are doing some mental calisthenics with reviewer number 2 at the moment. So anyway, so that's coming out. And then one thing we're also doing is one of the things that happens with these wave models is that very sudden bursty winds, the wave models that NOAA and these other operational folks run, aren't very good when the winds turn around or have a lot of transients to them. So we're actually doing some direct numerical simulation modeling of wind wave generation to try to get a better idea of what happens in a relatively small time scale, and see whether or not we can do a better job of parameterizing that behavior at very small times, or relatively small times, sort of along the same time scales as the gusts that occur during the shamals. And then tsunami wave modeling, we're in the lab at Oregon State University, where we've got, this kind of looks like something out of a Poe story, I think the Cascabel Amontillado. But anyway, so we've got wave gauges all over the place, and we've also got a sediment pit right here where we've got some of the strangest sediment that we are ever able to buy. I think it's like 0.8 millimeters, which when you scale it up to the actual wave scale, it's like big boulders. But it still seems to move around. And I think I'll just close here because we're still, where'd my video go? We're still able to, we're still going through the data at the moment. So can I escape and maybe show the video?
Let's do Alt-Tab.
Alt-Tab?
Alt-Tab.
Okay, Alt-Tab. Oh, there it is. Okay, so I'll show this. And hopefully it'll play. Double click. No?
The touchpad doesn't have a click.
Oh, no. Okay. Okay, open with
I mean, you just have to press the button.
VLC. Okay. Okay. So here comes the tsunami. So this is just the very first set of a lab test that we did last year at Oregon State, and we're supposed to go out there again, but a lot of it depends on whether or not they can get this wave maker fixed in time. So if they end up not getting it fixed before NEAS ends, I'm not sure what we're going to do. But anyway, so that's that we're pouring through. We got a ton of data we're kind of going through at the moment. So anyway, that's the talk. So if there are any questions or comments or anything like that.
Well, the big question, I got a couple, but in general for the Center for Emergency Informatics, what's your wish list? Do you want computer scientists to help you with the models? Do you want citizen science, people maybe not seeing a tsunami, but trying to set up their little wave gauges or
yeah, I think
like that? What would you like?
I think if the data, we need data, and I think if we had citizen scientists or whomever who would be able to come up with even rough estimates of what's going on in terms of the wave heights, the surge levels that they may be, like when that guy called me up and asked me about what the elevation of the flooding was in my house. I mean, if there was a way to I hate to bother people as they're cleaning out their houses and have them come up with a tape measure and saying, oh, it's about 28 feet. But if some of that data is not only very valuable, but it's also perishable, right? Because it doesn't last very long. It'll last until they've clean out their drywall or start fixing the place up. So that sort of information is invaluable, I think. That we could really use that.
Well, that's the thing. I'm thinking of my friends in Pensacola that they said, oh, the surge was 6 feet in my house. And the other person said, well, it was 7 in mine. I said, well, how do you know? So because the drywall, we measured it.
Yeah.
And it seems to be, having lived building codes, kind of a point of pride. People measure that anyway, right? Because you can tell everybody.
Right, exactly.
How bad it is. So my thought is that would be possible to get.
Yeah.
You do normally get that. It's not
right, yeah.
Matter trying to explain their neighbors whatever.
Right, and so for the insurance guy who comes by, he says, we cover everything above that line, and anything below that line, I hope you have flood insurance.
Yeah, and then, or just even having the pictures, we could probably pull it off of that. What we're seeing is a lot of people place pictures that, because they want to show their relatives and friends, look how bad.
Right. If they were able to do that, we can estimate what the flood level was inside their house, and based on records, we'd be able to figure out what the floor pad elevation might be.
Yeah, so. If you have their address,
the
GPS should be able to look like that.
Right. You're saying that there's an incentive to understate what the height was?
No, overstate. I think, I don't know about insurance purposes. I think a lot of it, as Robin said, is a point of pride. It's like, I survived this surge, Can you believe this? Yeah, I know. Yeah, so I think something like that would be really useful. I think that the more data we can get, the better. Especially, for a lot of the stuff we're doing, like in Qatar, it's basically just, the whole area is undersampled, but even right after a storm, if we're able to get some of that data so we can do a prediction or a hindcast of what happened, that would be really useful, I think. So.
Do you find yourself using Monte Carlo techniques very much?
Yeah, we've actually done, one of the things that we did with the Navy is essentially sort of meta modeling. So basically asking the question, okay, what happens if you're a guy who's maybe you have the title, you're an actual enlisted person, you have the title, maybe you've taken an oceanography course, maybe a little bit of numerical modeling, but you're not an expert, and so you have to set up a model right away. So then, and not only that, but the last thing you want to do is try to figure out, oh, what's that friction coefficient again, that kind of thing. So there's going to be errors that are going to be incorporated based on the way you set up the model, which may not be optimal, based on a prediction on the input parameters that you put in, which you may not know, and so on. And so, based on what we're trying to do for that is use Bayesian statistics and kind of get an idea of, okay, in order for us to compare what we need data to compare to, but in order for us to do the best comparison to data, these are the conditions that have had to have existed in order for us to do that. So this has got to be the bottom friction coefficient, for example, in order for us to compare best to data, or this has to be the input wave condition, that kind of thing.
Do you find insurance companies motivated to do kinds of Monte Carlos where they say something like, we think we understand the modeling of basis, and we think we know what the static thing is, and now we have a distribution of what hurricanes are going to be, and then just do a massive Monte Carlo of, in other words, gaining likelihood data by Monte Carlo rather than by standard deviation kinds of thinking.
Right. They have done that, as far as I can tell. I know I've got several colleagues at University of Florida and University of Central Florida who have done a lot of modeling for insurance companies of the surge after Katrina, and they were trying to figure out, okay, because the big question there was my house damaged by wind or by water?
Right.
Because a lot of
I know,
and for you know, like in my neighborhood, we didn't have to have flood insurance, even if you had a mortgage. We had it because I told I did have it, yes. I know. Well, it lapsed, and then I was about 3 months before, well, let's see, it was in March of 2005, I got a little bug in my ear and it said, re-up your flood insurance. So I did, and I maxed it up because we had just added a second floor to the house. And then 30 days later was in effect, and 3 months after that, I needed it. So I told my wife I should be able to exercise all manner of bad judgment for the rest of my life, because now I'm just, you know, it's just like, you know, that kind of thing, because I've already proven myself. So anyway, so yeah, we did have flood insurance. That was really very, very useful. But so.
But you're interested in these legal distinctions about whether flood or you know, but in terms of talking about appropriateness of insurance rates, there's a trade. If you start doing Monte Carlo, I suppose there's a trade-off between what I was dismissing a few minutes ago as fast algorithms, because you might want to be saying, can I do 10,000 runs with a medium good model versus 100 runs with a super active model. Right. And that might give different statistics.
Right. Yeah, that's true.
Well, and it seems like also the citizen science idea, and so that could be used to. I know there's a difference between wind and wave, and I've learned that from insurance, but structural is that would also perhaps help calibrate the damage models for entire neighborhoods.
Right.
So you get at least a couple of people start populating that. You know, what John's always looking at as redlining different neighborhoods and saying what's going to be evacuated, what can be re-entered, versus no, you're going to be pointed out.
Right. Yeah. Well, one of the things that, too, in terms of damage, that's still sort of not sort of a point that that needs the active investigation is the effect of waves on the damage, right? So, in a lot of cases in Hurricane Ike, we saw, you can see, okay, surge is basically just taking the house off its moorings and just kind of dumping it somewhere inland, but there are a lot of cases where you can actually see the floor joist just kind of accordioned in and collapsed, and that's definitely a wave-related phenomenon where the wave got high enough, the surge got high enough so the waves are big enough to actually cause that kind of damage. And the codification of that level of damage due to a wave is still an area that requires some more investigation, I think. Some initial work has been done, but in order to be able to do something like add the effect of waves to resiliency and damage curves, that's still a ways out.
And I'm sure none of this information ever gets to the people actually doing the evacuation, onto doing the planning, or back to resetting their codes. Right. So that disconnect.
Exactly. Right. So there's a lot of that information doesn't ever feed back really to after the post-disaster survey. A lot of times that information is just kind of, well, this is our ASCE report, and maybe the insurance company makes use of it, but we as modelers and as scientists don't see it again.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure a presentation I saw 2 days ago by the Nature Conservancy, they would have been just even the implication of vegetation in any way is probably worse. Just wipe out, the whole reason for existence of that group.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
And it's probably, there's times where it probably helps if it doesn't.
Yeah.
And that, but we're not always using a lot of models.
Right.
Another thing is that Dylan Shell is probably one of the best people to look at how to use your AQ to get the pattern to optimize the space of the box.
All right.
He does that for complex geometries and how to do sampling. So,
okay, great.
So but think of things that are really interesting. And they're trying to get the head of the insurance commissioner to come and talk about how insurance works. The flood insurance, and of course, everybody in social sciences believe that the flood insurance, the payment flood insurance, was the absolute worst thing that ever happened in coastal development. Yeah. Because it's subsidizing bad decisions.
Right.
Yeah. And I actually, Craig Fugate, head of FEMA, actually referred to it as socialists. Totally socialist. Inadvertently, there's not a cost benefit to the overall taxpayer. Anyway, lots of cool stuff. Thank you so
sure.
much. I learned a lot.
Oh, sure.
One of the things that is that Camille, so having grown up on the coast, is that Camille, I'm thinking of Joshua Barber's work in communication risk, is that Camille's always been the bad one.
Yeah.
And
it's been the benchmark.
I don't recall anybody mentioning Katrina could be bigger than Camille.
Right. Well, because they looked at the category.
The older people have said Camille was traumatic.
Yeah.
Right. It's the one that stays in everybody's mind.
Right.
And so the idea that Katrina had any potential to be worse than Camille would have probably caught a little more attention than the old guard anyway.
Well, I think the problem, I remember that time, because, and I remember talking to people about that, and they said that, they would do things like, well, I'm not going to board up unless it's at least a category 4. So they use that sort of, and the categories is still, it's got its uses, but it's still a little bit antiquated, because it's just wind speed. You don't talk about the size of the storm or anything like that. The amount of rain, right, exactly. So I think in that sense, when Katrina landed, I think it was probably a 2, but when it was coming, it was heading toward the Gulf, toward the coast, it was a 3, and people are going to not going to bother with that. And that was an unfortunate decision.
Yeah, that was terrific. Well, anyway, thank you very much.
Sure.
Thank you, speaker.